This is Duke University.
Good evening, everyone. Wow, this is a well-behaved group. You must have gone to Duke or something. I'm Jim Duff, and I am CEO here at the museum and president and CEO of the Freedom Forum, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here this evening for what promises to be a very special program. It combines two of the most outstanding programs from one of the nation's most outstanding institutions of higher learning, as you all well know. Most of you, I assume, being alum from Duke. The Duke Divinity School and the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke. At a brief meeting we had up in my office before this evening's event, my predecessor, Charles Overby, observed that you would be very hard-pressed to find any institution in any walk that's doing better work in its field than Duke Divinity School. That's very high praise from Charles Overby, who's someone who knows. And I know how highly thought of the Sanford School of Public Policy is here in Washington. In my previous careers, I worked at the Supreme Court on a number of occasions and actually had many opportunities to combine divinity, draw from the divinity and public policy realm, because I often prayed to God to help bail me out of predicaments that I found myself in there. Well, we're particularly proud to host tonight's program on what biography reveals about the presidential candidates, as it fits so nicely into our mission here at the museum and with the Freedom Forum in educating the public about our civic education responsibilities and educating the public about our freedoms and the form of government. And as Thomas Jefferson observed on many occasions, the only and best way to preserve our freedoms ultimately is to have an engaged and informed citizenry. And I know tonight will further those objectives. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce the Dean of Duke Divinity tonight, Dean Richard Hayes, who, as those of you here know, he's internationally known and recognized for his work on the letters of Paul and New Testament ethics. Dean Hayes, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. It's very good to be here this evening, and it's especially good to be in a room full of Duke alums right now. Last Saturday night, I was at the football game, and the score was Duke 33, Carolina 30. So it's good to have a room full of people who can celebrate that with me and realize what an unusual event this is. This is my first time at the museum. I don't know if many of you have been here a lot before. I've never been here before, and one of the highlights I've already discovered is going in the men's room here and seeing the plaques on the wall that have the newspaper bloopers, sort of headlines that are unintentionally funny, things like Hillary Clinton on welfare, or never withhold herpes infection from loved one. And the one that particularly struck me as pertinent to this evening's event is dishonesty policy voted in by Senate. Now that struck me as particularly pertinent because this is a gathering to talk about the relationship, among other things, between faith, character, and public policy and leadership in our country. And Duke University is a place that is very well suited to provide panelists to help us think about that well and wisely, because one of the characteristics that I think distinguishes Duke University is the interdisciplinary relationship of all our professional schools. The fact that our schools of law and medicine and nursing and public policy and divinity and business all collaborate with one another to an extraordinary extent, and you're going to see some evidence, I hope, here of the fruitfulness of that sort of conversation this evening. The Divinity School is a place where we try to cultivate and honor the union of faith and learning, to hold up the highest standards of international scholarship with an equally passionate commitment to forming communities of faith that are communities of character. So the way I would understand that most deeply is to say that what I hope we'll be thinking about here this evening is, with regard to our presidential candidates, how does our politics either help us to tell truthful stories or not? So my next task here this evening is to introduce the Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy, Bruce Cunningham.
Thank you. In 1962, following President Kennedy's failures that contributed to the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and the president's thoughtful application of lessons he and his staff learned from that experience in addressing the subsequent Cuban Missile Crisis, Robert Kennedy sent a letter to former Secretary of Defense Robert Lovett, thanking him for a quotation that Lovett had produced during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That quotation observed very simply, "Good judgment is usually the result of experience, and experience is frequently the result of bad judgment." One of the many things that biography can reveal about the character of presidential candidates is how they've responded to and learned from failures. The critical question is not whether they've made mistakes. Any historian or biographer can tell you that they have, but the extent to which they've experienced failure and that they've been able to learn from their shortcomings, and exactly what it is they've learned that may have strengthened their characters or endowed them with better judgment. I hope tonight's discussion, motivated by Phil Bennett, touches on this theme for each of the candidates. Phil is the Eugene C. Patterson Professor of the Practice of Journalism and Public Policy at Duke Sanford School of Public Policy, where he's part of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy, and Jay Hamilton, the director of the center, is here. He's the one that conceived of this idea. And he's also going to be part of our new Duke and DC program that will be inaugurated this spring. And Kristen Goss is there. She's going to be heading up that program. He's also simultaneously the managing editor of FRONTLINE, the public affairs television series broadcast on PBS. He served as foreign editor of the Boston Globe, foreign editor of the Washington Post, and subsequently the managing editor of the Washington Post, during which he supervised 800 journalists, and the Post won 10 Pulitzer Prizes under his aegis. Phil joined the Duke University faculty in 2009, where he teaches about journalism ethics and national security secrecy, the news media and Islam, and narrative journalism in the digital age. He was meanwhile named managing editor of FRONTLINE in April 2011. I'm very honored to introduce him, a man who, perhaps because he doesn't yet have a biographer, has managed to avoid having any of his failures that he's experienced from appearing on or explaining his impressive resume. So, Phil.
He's also losing his voice, unfortunately, but I'm going to try to drink water and make it through. Yeah, thank you, Bruce. Given that the part of our national pastime seems to be to blame the moderator, I don't want to set expectations too high. You're not going to listen to me very much over the next hour. We're fortunate to have a really outstanding panel with us tonight to help us navigate this elusive but very important subject of theme of biography, character, and the presidency. And I want to introduce each member briefly, and then we'll move on with the proceedings. My friend Michael Kirk, sitting next to me, is the country's preeminent documentarian about contemporary Washington, especially its intersections of power, personality, and history. He was one of the founders of FRONTLINE, and over the last 30 years has made more than 200 films for the series and won virtually every award given to documentary filmmakers. He is the producer of The Choice 2012, the biographical film about Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, about which more in a moment, and of previous films about Obama, Bush, the 2000 campaign, and many, many other subjects. Stanley Hauerwas is the Gilbert T. Rowe Professor of Theological Ethics at Duke Divinity School, with an appointment at Duke Law School. Considered one of the world's leading theologians, he is renowned for interdisciplinary exploration of narrative, ethics, and political theory. His book, A Community of Character Toward a Constructive Christian Social Ethic, was selected as one of the 100 most important books on religion of the 20th century. Reverend Alisa Lasater Wailoo is pastor of the Capitol Hill United Methodist Church here in Washington, where she shepherds a diverse congregation that serves the powerful and the homeless. A graduate of Duke Divinity School, she has twice offered the opening prayer for the U.S. House of Representatives. We're going to start today with two brief clips taken from the Choice 2012, the film Mike Kirk made, and which was broadcast on public television earlier this month. They show our presidential candidates at the same age of many of the students I teach at Duke, at a point of self-discovery. After the clips, I'm going to ask each of the panelists a question or two, and we'll dive into a discussion. With about 20 minutes left in the hour, we'll open the floor to your questions. So let's see the clip now, if we might.
In 1966, the Mormon Church called Mitt Romney at the end of his freshman year at Stanford. It was time to become a Mormon missionary.
You were sort of sent out on your own in very difficult circumstances, so you prove your stuff. Can you make it?
Mitt, like most Mormon young men, had to leave home for a rigorous rite of passage.
And that means standing up for your faith under very adverse circumstances. It means working hard when you have many reasons to be discouraged, when people are not paying attention to you.
For Mitt Romney, service to the Mormon Church had a special meaning. The Romney family traced their roots back to the church's earliest days.
Not only were his parents very prominent, his family, back to the days of Brigham Young, was very prominent. His extended family is one of the leading Mormon families.
Mitt's great-grandfather Miles was an early church leader who had established a colony in Mexico.
The Romneys had left the United States and went to Mexico to avoid persecution, but it's also to pursue polygamy.
Miles Romney had 5 wives and 30 children.
They built a ranch, and he's back in Stone Age conditions with no money. Romney's father is now on the scene. That gets destroyed by guerrillas. They move back to California. Poverty again, they build it back up. They move back to Salt Lake City, they build it back up. Romney's whole history of a family is that they knocked us down, we built it back up. We didn't make a fortune, we made a bunch of fortunes. And they resented us for our success, but we kept coming back. That's Romney's history.
With someone like a name with Romney, and you heard about the sufferings of your ancestors and their sacrifices and all they've done, that you feel like, well, it's my turn now. I've got to pick up the baton and run with it.
But Mitt and his family rarely tell the story to outsiders.
It's an incredible history. He can't talk about it because it involves polygamy. And so if the core of your personality is something you can't talk about because it's politically unacceptable, well, you're not going to be open with the people all around you.
Now, the church was sending Mitt away to spend 2.5 years on a mission in France.
As Mitt Romney has said, imagine going to Bordeaux and saying to people, I've got a great new religion for you, and by the way, give up your wine.
The task, to put on a suit and tie and climb on your bicycle.
The tried and true, well-worn method was knocking on doors. And so we knocked on thousands and thousands and thousands of doors.
The Mormon mission does teach you to deal with rejection. Most people are not thrilled to see a pair of Mormon missionaries on their door.
Rejection was at the heart of the experience.
And it means cultivating your own inner spiritual life. Where else are you going to get the resources and the strength to carry on this difficult work of knocking on people's doors and pleading with them to listen to you, unless you feel like God is with you?
Barack Obama came east to engage the world, especially the black world. He started by moving to the edge of Harlem.
Well, if we wanted things to be harder for ourselves, we succeeded wonderfully It was kind of a gritty neighborhood. The apartment next door to us on the 3rd floor was burned out and stayed that way the whole time that we lived there. We had like 5 locks on the door, including one of those bars that you put in after you've gone inside the apartment.
A couple of friends from the Oxy days joined him.
I think the first thing was a complete intimidation by New York City, which seemed rougher and tougher and uncivilized than any other place either of us had lived. And both of us were probably questioning, why the heck did I come to this place? It was scary, we had no resources.
Well, New York to me is the key to his life. It's the period where he does the least, but figures out the most.
To find a connection to the black community, Obama headed out into Harlem and all over the city. But it turned out to be harder than Obama imagined.
And he told me this when I interviewed him in the White House. He made no lasting African-American friends during those 4 years in New York.
No Choom gang. The inner circle was much smaller.
The New York years are marked by this kind of turning inward. He spends time reading, fasting, wandering the city. There's this almost monk-like existence.
As he walked the streets, friends say he was affected by the poverty all around him.
He saw transformation over the Barry I had met in Occidental. He got very serious and less lighthearted, and our conversations were more about serious things, and wouldn't want to go around the bar, have a drink, was worried about poor people, didn't care about getting rich. You know, that to me, I mean, that's my opinion of dull at that time.
There's one great letter where he describes how all of his Choom gang friends are sort of getting into the mainstream, and his Pakistani friends are all moving toward the business world. And to him, all of that seems too small, too categorized, too limiting.
Caught without a class, a structure, or tradition to support me. In a sense, the choice to take a different path is made for me. The only way to assuage my feelings of isolation are to absorb all the traditions, classes, make them mine, me theirs.
And he's trying to say, where do I fit? For me to exist, I have to be larger than it. I have to embrace it all, make it all mine. He writes that. And I think in that simple sentence, you see everything about who he wanted to be and what he needed. He didn't want to be limited.
That's great. Well, so Mike, when you're telling that story, you're competing against the stories that the campaigns are putting out, the pundits are bringing. Even in the case of Barack Obama, you're competing with dreams of my father. How do you find that the story that you're discovering diverging from the official story or the story that's already out there, and how do you know when you've arrived at what feels like the true story?
Yes, it's even worse than that, of course. I made a film in 2008 about Barack Obama, The Choice in 2008, when he ran against John McCain, and I thought I knew everything about him then, too. So the bar was pretty high, and Mitt Romney, for example, everybody we talked to in the beginning, we worked on it for about a year, said, well, he's the hidden man. You're never going to get anywhere near the real Mitt Romney, who he is. So you're right. It's an unbelievably, I think, challenging test for what we set out to do. We of course, contacted the campaigns who consistently lied to us or fed us in the wrong direction, sent us, offered us people, clips, pictures, things that were less than useful most of the time. And they have a story they want to tell, and they spent tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars telling it. So what did we do? We went out, we go out and we're looking at the family, the friends, the enemies, the people who work with them, the associates, over life, more than 100 people for the purposes of this film. Interviews that last 2.5, 3, 4 hours. Duke University's oral history project is a place to access those interviews, a wonderful resource. And then you look for sort of 5 or 6 or 7 pivotal moments. We all have them in our lives, really central places where we all made a decision that mattered at an important time in our life. So I tried to identify what those were for Barack Obama. I tried to identify what those were for Mitt Romney. I looked for the most obvious stories. So Obama doesn't have a father ever. Romney has a dominant and powerful father figure. Obama, throughout his life, has no faith, as far as we know, no religious experiences. Romney, from the very beginning, one of the first questions I ask is, what does a Mormon boy grow up like? What's in his head? What are his expectations of life? And then you go to the other end, which is, what are the events that you know have happened to them, that what happens in their early life can be a clue to explaining? So why did Obama, from the very beginning of his administration, go for health care? What is it that makes him do that at the very beginning? What moments in his life were coming from such tremendous dysfunction? I was stunned by how dysfunctional his life was. Nothing like Dreams of My Father. It is a memoir, but it's not a truth story. It's closer to a novel than anything else. It's a composite of characters. It has a point of view, which is race, a journey of discovery about race. There's so much more that was interesting to Obama, who grew up alone, being left and leaving. All of those, how does that dysfunctional young boy become the man who decides to have a way grand vision of something like Obamacare in his first term, in the first weeks of office? And for Romney, what is it that makes him, he was destroyed in 2008. He was done in politics. What is it that happened in his life that made him be the man who watches our economy crater in 2008 and says, I'm a white knight. I'm the guy who can come back in and do it? Where does that come from? Does it have resonance in his religion and his missionary experiences? Those are the kind of questions we ask. I think those are the kind of stories we tried to tell. Without overstating it, the goal was to provide you and other viewers with a sense of who these men are and how they may act when they become president. So it's not about specific issues. It is really about the formation of their character, as told to us from the people who know them best. We never interview the candidates. That's, to me, the most fundamental decision we make, because to interview them is to get, you're in an echo chamber with them about what their handlers have told them. We've all watched this on the debates. The truth of it is, the only way we could get at anything that approximates a kind of truth was not to talk to them directly about it.
So character is a key to action, too. Professor Hauerwas, when you and I spoke earlier, and I was actually speaking, you said you couldn't understand how anybody who could write Dreams of My Father would want to be president. I thought it was amusing. But when we spoke about this event, you also mentioned the work of Duke political scientist David James Barber, who famously organized presidential character into various categories. So I wanted to hear more of your reflection on that, and also to ask you, how do you judge character? And is character something that is built? I mean, we use that phrase. Does that seem true to you?
Anybody have David James Barber's course on presidential character? Well, great. And he thought he could locate 4 particular character types, and he used primarily psychological descriptions. There is the active, positive person who is self-confident, flexible, creates opportunities for action, enjoys exercise of power. He associated that with Jefferson, Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Ford, and Bush, George W. Bush. Then he had the active, negative, who have more passive characteristics in terms of having compliant personalities insofar as they seek to be loved. They're easily manipulated, and their low self-esteem is overcome by ingratiating personality. He associated this with Madison, Taft, Harding, Reagan, and Clinton. Then he has a passive positive personality types, whom he types as having compulsive attempts to exercise power as a means of self-realization. They expend great energy on task, but they get little joy from it. They are preoccupied with whether they are failing or succeeding. He associated this with Adams, Wilson, Hoover, Lincoln, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. And finally, you have the passive negative, who are people that are fundamentally withdrawn. They respond to a sense of duty. They avoid power. They have low self-esteem, compensated by service to others. They respond rather than initiate. He associated this with George Washington, Calvin Coolidge, and Dwight Eisenhower. That schema just had one problem. It couldn't predict anything. The attempt to show some kind of causal relationship between these psychological, which were categories which are much more like temperament than character, was proved exactly made very difficult, showing why certain decisions were made, why certain public policies were developed. And I think that partly has to do with the fact that he really didn't look in a very careful way with what he meant by character. Because character names contingent relationships between our events in our lives that we try to give narrative coherence to, but oftentimes misdescribe. Yeah. So character is another name for being deeply self-deceived. And of course, exactly in the moral traditions, character is made up of the virtues that are supposed to be able to help you be less self-deceived. Now, one of the things I think that David James Barber work does is at least suggest that it's very hard to know what difference the character of a person is going to make for the presidency, because the presidency is a trap. Do you really think you're going to impose your will in terms of the givens of presidential life? So one of the questions becomes is really whether looking at the prior biographies is going to tell you, given the demands of the presidency itself. Remember, presidents are the most controlled people in the world. They only know what their advisors tell them. So exactly how character is going to make a difference within the decision-making processes of the presidency, I think is a very hard matter to predict.
Well, let's return in a minute to this question of the predictive elements of character. Reverend Wailoo, I wanted to ask you, you're really seeing things through your pastoral work, and you're having access to things at a deep level and at an everyday level too. And when we spoke earlier, you said something I've thought of since, which is you said, if we ask the presidential candidates to be their histories, we are limiting what they have to offer. What did you mean by that? And how would you characterize, sitting a couple blocks from here up on Capitol Hill, how would you characterize how you interact with character or with self-deception, as it might be?
First, I'm giggling because I think what I said, although I like what you just said.
I'm an editor. But
I think what I said was if we're asking them to give up their history.
Oh, I see, okay.
But that's beautiful because it's a both and.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely both and. And that came out of, we were having a conversation about the vice presidential debates and the question they received about character. And I don't know if I wasn't dumbfounded, I've been in DC long enough for that, but I was saddened by the fact that neither man would say something distinct about their character. And I think you and I started discussing, are they afraid to share? And sort of what hit me was that I think they believe that it is our expectation for them to be a blank slate that we can project our desires for them upon. So to share too much prevents that ability for us to project and reflect them being our representative. I don't know if you found that to be true in your studies. And so the challenge then is, if we're expecting them to be a blank slate, and we're not getting the depth of their history, then we're also not getting the depth of what they have to offer. Or vice versa, to the question you thought or the statement you thought I made, we're binding them to our understanding of their history, rather than letting that become what it could be for us as our representative. And what I mean by that is, I think, we have a 3-month-old, and I'm sleeping about every 2 hours. I'm being woken up, so I do have to look at my notes lots. Not fully present, but one of the things that struck me in watching the video, and one of the things that strikes me with the congressmen and the staffers that are in my pews regularly, and honestly strikes me with our homeless men, for that matter, is that they know how important it is to simply be in the present, that's their expectation. When folks come into the church, we purposely don't ask them what they do, because in DC, what happens? You are what you do, period. And they want to be their history. They want to be from the South, or they want to be from a liberal father, or this, that. They want that to be a part of who they are. And in general, I think we ask them not to be that. But when we do that, when we ask them not to be their histories, I think what we're doing is we're selling ourselves short. We're not getting the fullness of them, and then their leadership is being sold short. And where I was going with this is that the core realities of who they are, of who these two men are actually core realities of America. And yet we won't let them be that. I mean, Barack Obama is the son of an immigrant. That is who we are. We love the narrative, right, of someone pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, or whatever phrase you want to use. We love that, but then we're afraid to let him fully be that, and all that means. It's a variety of religions, it's a variety of cultures, it's all of those things. And yet we can learn about ourselves as a nation and our character if we let him be who he is. And similarly, I think one of the things that struck me in your video was the point about Romney coming from polygamy. Well, it's very clear in Dreams of My Father that Obama's only 2 generations away from polygamy as well, right?
Not even.
Not even one, that's right, 1. And so fascinating to me that part of who Romney is, Governor Romney is he is someone who lives by the truth of religious freedom. I mean, who he is, he got to become who he is because of our belief in religious freedom, just like our belief in being a nation of immigrants. But we want to limit that. We're afraid of that. So to me, the question is as much about what their character tells us about what they will do as our need to limit their character, and how that affects all of our abilities and what we do. And I know many of us in this room help folks in these leadership roles. And so I think it's both and of why are we so afraid to let their histories be true in their fullness, and how does that limit us?
I think that's a great reflection. If I could follow up, I would ask, so where would you put polarization and partisanship into that model? So among the people that are a couple blocks from here who are defining themselves, maybe not their genuine character, but certainly their everyday political character as being on one side or on the other side, how do you begin to build a less polarized community on the basis of the dynamic that you're describing?
You're asking a Christian minister, so you're going to hear about brokenness. Yeah. But I think it does begin with, as the dean stated, dealing with people's failures. Because in people's failures that we become vulnerable, and it's in that vulnerability that we can be open to others and be formed. And when we want to hide the depth of their mistakes and why those mistakes happened, or the ways in which they feel hurt or broken, then we limit the ability, I think, for us to come together, because that is the most raw place. I think I shared with you, I remember clearly, right before the healthcare bill was passed, it was done on a Sunday night, I believe, isn't that correct?
Yeah.
And the congressman that came up and fell down at the altar for communion. And what that was to them, being bowed down next to a homeless man and being bowed down next to someone from the other party, all in an equal plane there. And there were hugs as they left the kneeler. So I think it's got to come down to being real about our pain from the past and our mess ups on some front.
Professor, you said before the 2008 election in an interview that elections are only the means to try to occasion the debates necessary for the discovery of goods in common that are impossible to be discovered without the debates. What are those goods in common that you see today, and do they seem as common as they did prior to the 2008 election?
Well, first of all, the language of goods in common is antithetical to a good deal of American political practice, because we don't believe that there are goods that are in common. We believe that the greatest number of interests that can be made compatible with one another is the good. Mm. So it's one of the great achievements of liberal democracies is to turn every issue of the good into an issue of interest. Mm. Because people that are determined to achieve their interest, we think, will not be, therefore, enthusiastic killers. Because who wants to kill over a privatistic interest? So the very language of the discovery of goods in common, for example, what would the discovery of a good in common be? It would be something like, we're a slave nation and we've never gotten over it. How do you come to terms with being a slave nation? How do you make that articulate within the political process of what it means to be a slave nation? I mean, it would mean that you would almost have to be a people that know how to confess sin. And that's just, you know, you make mistakes, but you're not sinners. So I think that how I've made that comment to try to direct attention away from the presumption that democracies are primarily determined by elections, because elections are only the means to force the articulation of by people of what the kinds of reframing we need to understand the character of our lives. And I think that isn't said sufficiently.
Could you pull something from the current campaign that embodies that?
No.
I was waiting for that.
What I ask is, just tell me the truth. Mm. And I'll support you if you tell me the truth. And for example, it would be wonderful if Obama or Romney might say, you know, we don't have the slightest damned idea what to do about the economy. I mean, you know, after the collapse, I'd suggested we ought to rename the economics department at Duke the Department of Superstition. But I mean, whoever, you know, got the idea that we really knew what was happening. So I think the kind of gesturing of candidates to show that they're in control puts us out of control in a way that relieves us of the responsibility of knowing how to think about these matters.
Wow. I'd add that Professor Hauerwas, in that same interview prior to the last election, said about then candidate Obama, but I do think that the expectations his election encouraged may become a deep problem because there's no way he can meet them. So.
Well, you know, he actually, there's lots of people we've talked to who said when he went out to Grant Park that night to accept the hundreds of thousands of people who were screaming and crying that night in Chicago of his election, that was a different Barack Obama who walked out onto that stage than the one who'd said, I'm fired up, ready to go, that he had articulated a kind of national intention through that campaign, starting in 2004 with the speech in Boston. We're not red, we're not blue, we're not black, we're not white, we're not Asian, we're not this, we're not, we are the United States of America. And that articulating that shared national intention is what he somehow knew, maybe intuitively, would get him to the White House, and it did. All of us projecting onto him something we wanted, some sense of, this is, or not all of us, but 50+% of us, saying, of the people who voted, saying this is what we want. And that when he walked out on that stage, he had said to people, ooh, I better notch it back a little bit, because he knew there was no way he was going to be able to deliver not just on the bipartisan promise, but on that as something that was articulated as, from a man who 4 years earlier had been a state senator, never held a single elective office beyond that, never really been challenged in any significant way. And there he was walking out on that stage. And when you watch in this film or any other time you want on YouTube, watch him walk out again with this in mind, that maybe he knows that he's not going to be able to deliver it. He has to go through the motions. He has to step up and face the furnace that he now knows. He's had he's heading into a transition period where he hears 2 wars and a completely cratered economy. Republicans who are angry about their posture vis-a-vis him now, and out he goes. And I see it in him when he walked out. The night it happened, I was there, and I said, I wasn't there, I was watching on television, and I said, oh my God, this is a different Barack Obama than I've seen on all the videotape and all the times I followed him around. So I think there is a sense that he knew that he'd gone maybe too far.
So I'd like to open up to questions from you in a moment. I'd like to ask one more, because I think we've sort of come where I feel like we are right now, is in really saying character maybe not predictive of action, people captive of history and their circumstances, perhaps even more than they are instruments of their biography. And maybe you started speaking about healthcare. You've watched the debates now. You've watched President Obama over the course of his first term. Where would you put right now the relationship between character and biography? Maybe not as a predictive element of a presidency, but in relation to just the decision making that a president undertakes, and perhaps in relation to the way that this campaign has unfolded.
There's a kind of, you're right, Stanley, that I don't think, I never pretended, or hope I never warranted, that predictive is what we deliver. I don't know that that's possible. It's not a crystal ball. It's a series of events and things that happen. But there are things that you watch over a lifetime that happen in formative years that take you all the way up to now. And you wonder why President Obama has no powerful men around him. Why are the most powerful people close to him Michelle and Valerie Jarrett, and not really David Axelrod and Rahm Emanuel? What happened there, and what is the implication of that in policy terms as all the things come forward to his office? What happened when his mom sent him home when he was 10 to live with his white grandparents? What did that do to be that boy at that time with no men in his life, no male mentors? There's not a male mentor in a lifetime that you can find. Not predictive, but it may be helpful to understand something about the way he's going to go on some issues and what he taught himself and how he taught himself to be something like a noumena where it bounces off him. All of our aspirations come forward and he receives them and feeds them back, but maybe he wasn't really pitching all of that anyway. What happened there? And Romney, with such a father, you watch our film, with such a father, such a set of rules, and the Mormon faith. How does he come to believe that he can fix the economy? How does he come to believe that he's the white knight? What supreme act of ego is involved in that? Or is it ego? Or is it hubris? Is it something he believes deep inside because of a series of things that happened to him, including a near-death experience in France when he went from being a boy, a prankster, to a serious man in the world? Comes back after 2.5 years, and something has changed, including faith, spirituality. Is it predictive? Maybe, maybe not. But does it tell us something maybe important about who they are and how they evaluate the decisions that will inevitably come before them of life and death? What does it mean to believe that there's a veil, and on the other side of the veil are people, your family, your father, everybody, who are living with you in a kingdom on earth, and they're back and forth? What does it mean when you're president and it's time to send boys and girls to war, to die? Do you feel about death the same way that you do if you aren't a person of faith who believes in the kingdom of God and believes that you're all going to see each other again someday in eternity? I don't have the answers to those things, but those are big and serious questions that I think we tried to raise in the film and that kind of haunt me as I watch the debates and think about 47 to 47 in the polls right now.
Other thoughts and reflections on that before we turn to questions from the audience?
I thought the letter that was quoted is extraordinary just to the extent that you think you can take it all in. And that strikes me as an extraordinary presumption that I'm sure is deep and wrong.
The notion that President Obama could take it all in.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a kind of way, I say, modernity names the time that you want to produce people who believe they should have no story except the story they chose when they had no story. That's called freedom. And the United States specializes in it. And it's all a story, it's a story that grips all of our lives. I can illustrate it this way. Do you feel like you ought to be held responsible for a decision you made when you did not know what you were doing? Most of us don't think we ought to be held responsible for decisions we made when we did not know what we were doing. Of course, that makes marriage unintelligible. I mean, how could you possibly know what you were doing when you promised lifelong monogamous fidelity? And of course, we think there's a solution to that. It's called divorce and remarriage. And that runs up against Hauerwas's law. Hauerwas's law is you always marry the wrong person. I mean, just give it a while, you know, they'll be right and then wrong again. And it works for the second and third marriages too. So the difficulty being with the story, you should have no story except the story you chose when you had no story, is the failure to recognize that that's a story you haven't chosen. And that seems to me the story that's determining his life. And
but he chose that story.
He chose it, right? Yeah, and it can be a very destructive story.
Yeah. And I think that's the one thing I'd add. and I sat under Dr. Hauerwas, so I remember that story you chose when you had no story. And actually thought of that when I heard Tom Daschle in the film talk about going out to a restaurant, sitting in the corner, talking to Barack Obama, and I think it was 2006 at that point.
Exactly.
About whether or not he was going to run for president. And what the representative said to now President Obama was, do it now while you don't have much history. Because when you have history, then they can hold you accountable to all these votes and all these positions and all these sorts of things. So do it when you can write your story.
Right.
Right. He was very careful when he was in the Illinois legislature not to get much of a history while he was there. I mean, of course, I got, you know, look, I'm going to vote for Obama. And Romney just scares the hell out of me exactly because it's hidden.
So.
Actually, that's not right. I've already voted for Obama.
Relieved to hear that. So, are there any questions, requests for marriage counseling? I can't see you, so you'd have to stand
There's
up.
a hand here. This way?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please go ahead.
During this campaign, I've been very grateful for fact checkers. And, excuse me, during the campaign, I've been very grateful for the fact checkers, especially after each debate. And when pick a candidate, it doesn't matter, makes what I'll characterize as a misstatement. And if you're somewhat informed, you know what the candidate or candidates is saying is wrong. At one point, when that same assertion is repeated over and over and over, does a citizen decide this person's just lying?
Good point. I agree.
We have one of our newscasters in Durham and Raleigh is going to chair the debate between our candidates for governor on Wednesday. And he called me up and said, what question should I ask them? And I said, ask them, how hard is it not to lie? And because if they say, oh no, I always tell the truth, you know you've got them in a lie. And I think part of the problem about the lie is how the people that are running for office understand oversimplifications, and they keep having to repeat them. And I think that puts them in a position of having to believe the lies they tell, and that is a very dangerous business.
It's like people who lie on their resume. You know, they tell the story. Who's the professor at Joe Ellis who had a Vietnam story that he just believed? And after a while, I think they really do believe the story that they tell. They believe it, and there's a fancy name for what it is. But in a way, if you're a candidate and you're stump speaking 7 states in 2 days and you're just saying the same thing, you're not thinking about what you're saying. You're just saying something you memorized. And the morality of that, the ethics of that, well, everybody knows. We're all gilding the lily, lying, shading it. That's what it is to a lot of those people.
Well,
Mike, question over here. I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. I was just going to say, would you say that both men feel like there's a grander vision, and so it is about, like that, your point on the marketability, that it's not that that Romney's changing his position, it's that he is one that goes in and sees what's marketable
Salesman.
and what work.
He's a salesman. Ever since one of the outgrowths of the mission was all those knocking on all those thousands of doors and being rejected. I really believe this. I've talked to I don't know how many people, 50 people who said Mitt Romney from that moment on became somebody who just sold the product. It's about the product. And that could either be good or bad. I mean, it may very well be that the product is a good product. The guy really believes that he fixed the Olympics. He really believes that he got health care to people in Massachusetts. He really believes that the country needs him, The economy's in a terrible shape, and all of his life and everything that he ever experienced has led him to this moment where he can sell fixing the economy, sell himself as a product. And that's what he did at Bain, and that's how he ran and he sees it as a sick company that he can come in and fix. And that is in his mind as a way to do it, and he'll say or do what he has to do that. Isn't that what politics is? And I think that's true also for President Obama, who had a huge idea that he really believed in, which is that if he, from his disintegrated life, could embrace everything and be of it and survive it and be black and white and Asian and all of it, then we all could. And if he could just get to Washington and just sit in a room with people and just talk to the Republicans about it, that they could understand the wisdom and the importance of where he was coming from and the charity that he was bringing to the process, that America would be a better place. And I think he really believed that. And the people we've talked to who watched him go from disintegration when he was little to a kind of integration to disintegration over the last 4 years, to the point where he was staring out the window, angry at Washington, angry at people who wouldn't listen to him, existentially unhappy. You have to believe that that's where all that's coming from, that it's a true, deep belief in both of these men based on their life experiences and what they've seen and what they've experienced. It may be the story that they tell themselves, surely the story they tell themselves. How do they get up in the morning and put their pants on and go out and, what, lie to all of us intentionally? I don't think so. I don't think so at all.
We had a question over here.
I think we all can accept and agree that character matters in all walks of life. My question for you all is, how do you really do an analysis of character of these men and leaders and discount or put into the mix the enormous hubris that is required for one to think you can run all this? Forget about the crashing economy, forget about all that. Just in general, just the regular job of running all this requires a lot of, I say hubris, but a lot of self-confidence, put it like that.
I've been around a lot of presidents, and they're all, the people who run for president are a special kind of breed that says, I can do this, I can do whatever this takes to run, let alone to run the country. And I think everybody I've ever talked to about this says every single one of them steps in the Oval Office and is thunderstruck at how little they really understood what was happening and what was going to be required. They just have no idea what the blast furnace is. And I think in some ways you have to be a little nutty to do it, to run for it and to get it and win. And then I don't know what you have to hope for that'll help you get through the storm. Where does that come from, whatever it's going to take to deal with what comes at you every single day?
One of the things that strikes me about Romney and Obama is neither of them come from the elites. And the elites at one time produced people who thought presidency was just part of being elite. Yeah. And
but you could argue, Stanley, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you could argue that he's from that Romney's line is that political aristocracy we have because of his dad running for president.
Right.
I mean, there is the Mormon thing, which puts him at
that's what I was thinking
side,
of.
yeah.
Right. But even his father, I mean, wasn't among the New England elites.
Right. Not a Bush, not a Kennedy.
Right.
Maybe one more question here.
Maybe with reference to Barber's quadrants or any other search to find some predictive nature in all this, tie together the last three, George W., Obama, and Romney. I wonder if there's any element in terms of character development or motivation that has to do with their environment around their parents or lack thereof, particularly maybe with males, the role of their father. I've often wondered whether George W. was driven towards some of his decisions, let's call them, to accomplish what his father may not have finished, whether Obama not having a father has no limit on that void to fill, so he's shooting pretty high. And maybe Mitt Romney's trying to finish what his father didn't also finish, which was running for the president.
I'll tell you one quote we left out of the film was Richard Bushman, the Mormon scholar. I guess that's how he'd describe a Mormon historian. He said that he really believed that part of what was driving Mitt Romney was that in the next life, he would, in the first place, he would believe that his father was with him all the time, even now, and that he's pleasing his father, and that in the next life, he would like to be able to say, I did it, Dad. It's, you know, so we didn't put it in the film, but he did say it, and it does feel like, you know, maybe it's something out there. Ann Romney broke down crying just after the interview, talking about how George is always with them, and she feels she talks to him with some regularity. There is a presence there. I don't know about HW and W. I know they have a very strong and occasionally strained relationship.
I'll never forgive the Bushes for being faux Texans. That goes all the way down. I mean, I've never thought I should have no story except the story I chose, but I had no story because I'm a Texan. The only two things ontologically that matter are God and Texas.
In that order?
In that order.
That can't be the last word. So do you have a reflection, Reverend, on this?
Not on this. Can I pop back if
yeah, absolutely.
We're at the last word to the notion of one's biography being predictive of their character. One's biography and character being predictive of what will happen. Well, I think it's an absolutely fascinating study. I think as Americans and as people of faith, we have to challenge that notion of it being predictive. I hope not. I hope the circumstances in which they find themselves when they walk in that Oval Office significantly humbles them and changes them. I was thinking about Abraham Lincoln's quote, and I looked it up to make sure I got it right, but nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. And so I think there's something very important to us both insisting that they be true to their histories and sharing that, and then us not expecting, whether it's a historical vote or a promise or what have you, to hold them when the situation changes.
Well, I want to thank our just wonderful, wonderful panelists, and thank you all for coming.
Good. Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.